Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Tonight on our show, a scathing report by the U.S. Department of Justice found serious deficiencies in the San Francisco Police Department. And two Stanford professors discuss how design concepts can help build a better life. But first, in San Francisco, one of the hottest races on the November ballot is taking off. City Supervisors Jane Kim and Scott Wiener are locked in a tight battle for termed-out State Senator Mark Leno's seat in the California legislature. Wiener is openly gay and represents the city's Castro district. He's an advocate for public transit and won paid leave for parents in San Francisco. Fellow Democrat Jane Kim is portraying herself as a fighter for tenants' rights and affordable housing, and was endorsed by Bernie Sanders. KQED senior editor for politics and government, Scott Shafer, has more.
And joining me now are candidates Scott Wiener and Jane Kim to discuss their political philosophies and why they want to head to Sacramento. Welcome to both of you. What quality do you think each of you would bring that's in short supply in Sacramento?
Well, I think, one, we really need a progressive voice in Sacramento. In fact, we're increasingly seeing business-friendly Democrats come up to Sacramento. And a representative from San Francisco is going to have a lot of flexibility and independence to fight for LSAC reforms, to fight for more affordable housing, and also to work to make higher education affordable again here throughout the state. I have a ballot measure, Proposition W, that, if it passes, which I believe it will make San Francisco the first city in the nation to make community college free again for all of our residents, and that's the type of work that I want to bring up to Sacramento.
What about you? And let me just ask, if I could,
Sure.
You are openly gay, of course. Mark Leno, who is leaving the Senate, is. How important is that, do you think, to have an LGBT person from the Bay Area?
I think it's very important. Right now, we have one remaining LGBT representative from San Francisco, Mark Leno, who's termed out, and having an LGBT voice from San Francisco in the state legislature is important. Our straight allies are unbelievably important, but we have to have our own seat at the table. And I've been working for 25 years to support my community, the LGBT community. But it goes beyond that. I think even my harshest critic would acknowledge that I am tenacious. I don't just pick an issue and then get a headline and give up. I see it through till the end. So I'm going to go up to Sacramento and fight for more funding for affordable housing, for better support for transit, and to really push back when the drug companies or the insurance companies are depriving people of access to health care.
Affordability is a huge issue in San Francisco. You've alluded to the lack of housing, lack of affordable housing. There's an issue up before the Board of Supervisors next week on Airbnb. There's now an amendment to an existing law to tighten the restrictions from 90 days to allow people to rent a room for 90 days versus 60 days. Do you support tightening that up, and what are your thoughts about how Airbnb is affecting affordability in San Francisco?
So I don't think that's the best way to describe the difference between the two legislation. There really is no limit in the initial legislation that we had written in terms of the number of nights that someone can host someone in their home as long as they live there. The problem is that there's no way for San Francisco to enforce that. How are we going to know if you are staying here on Monday night versus Wednesday night? What President Breed has introduced is a hard cap. So regardless of how many nights you sleep at your home, which we really can't determine anyway, we're saying that you can rent out your house for no longer than 60 days. Now, I'm not going to say 60 days is the right day or 90 days is the right day, but I've always pushed for a hard cap because that is the only way we can enforce that type of legislation. I actually support short-term rentals, but I really want it to be true short-term rentals.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Scott, what's your position on that?
Sure. So I've always been an advocate for good and tough regulation of short-term rentals to make sure that we are not removing entire units, entire apartment buildings from the housing stock. We should crack down on those abuses, and we have been cracking down. And I've been a supporter of better enforcement resources and mechanisms. But if someone has a spare bedroom in their house and they want to rent it out a few nights a week to generate extra income, we should allow them to do that, and we shouldn't be banning them from doing it.
San Francisco has benefited in many ways from the tech influx. There's a lot of jobs here now, people working in tech, but some people feel it's also made the affordability issue worse. Net, is the influx of tech to San Francisco net plus or net minus?
I don't think actually the issue is the jobs that we are creating. The issue is the amount of affordable and middle-income housing that we are creating, and that has always been my top priority. Well, we should be a city that can accept and absorb jobs and greater growth here in the Bay Area. But what we haven't done is we haven't adequately protected our residents and our existing tenants, which is why I fought for and authored the boldest tenant protection legislation in the country back in 2014. And we also have to make sure that when we allow market rate developers to build here in our city, because they are generating profit from our land, that we need to ask them to build more affordable and middle-income housing, and that is what I fought for. We are the only city in the country that has won 40% affordable housing and middle-income housing on any of our projects, and I'm proud to have negotiated every single one of those deals in the district I represent.
Yeah. Scott?
So I think singling out one industry and saying we don't want you here, we don't want headquarters here, we don't want good-paying jobs here is the wrong approach. What we need to do is address our own housing problems that we created as a city by making it too hard to create housing. We need more housing, and we need to make it easier to create housing.
Do you think you can put too much of an emphasis on demanding from developers a certain percentage of affordable units?
So I think it's important for developers to contribute to affordable housing and also to transit. I authored the legislation that for the first time requires residential developments to pay transit impact fees. That's incredibly important. But developers, through their fees, can't solve on its own our housing crisis. Ultimately, we as a city have to take responsibility, and I've done that by authoring legislation to allow for new in-law units, or legislation to make it easier to build student housing, or legislation to allow for smaller studios, so-called micro units, or to relax density and to increase heights. We as a city have to take responsibility for our housing problems.
Both of you have been running ads, or ads have been running on your behalf. We're going to take a look at from each of you, and we'll start with one from that was run on your behalf, Scott, called See Jane Run. Let's take a look.
See Jane Kim support affordable housing. See Jane support projects with no affordable housing. See Jane Kim support the Twitter tax break. See Jane oppose it.
So Scott Wiener, I know that ad wasn't run by your campaign, but it was run on your behalf by Equality California, and it ends up by saying that Jane Kim, why does she betray her values? Do you think that she betrays her values?
You know, first of all, I'm proud to have Equality California's support. It's the second largest LGBT civil rights organization in the country, and EQCA has prioritized my race as a gay man. I have had my own critiques of Supervisor Kim.
But do you stand by that ad? I mean, does she betray her values?
That's not my ad. I've criticized Supervisor Kim for opposing the soda tax, or for not supporting legislation to stop Academy of Art University from cannibalizing rent-controlled housing stock, or for supporting tents on sidewalks.
Do you think is that an unfair charge then?
Those are my criticisms, and I can only speak for myself. It's not my ad. I will speak for my ads, which I stand by. And Supervisor Kim and I have had many debates, and we've talked about our differences of opinion. And to me, that's what it's about as a candidate.
And Jane Kim, you have been criticized for whatever you want to call it, flip-flopping on Ross Mercury. You were against him, you were for him, you were against him. Twitter tax breaks. Is that an unfair accusation that you are a kind of finger in the wind politician?
I'm not a one-dimensional elected official, and if people want to see someone who is simplistic, then I'm probably not the right elected for them. But if you read my statements on affordable housing, on the sheriff, on what are tax exclusion for our companies, you'll see that I've actually been very consistent. Around the sheriff decision, I was very clear about the fact that I don't think 11 elected officials have a lot of purview to remove another elected official. The city charter is very clear. If voters give you the job, voters should take it away. And I said that day, I didn't believe the city charter allowed the Board of Supervisors to remove the sheriff. But if the voters want to do a recall, that I would be happy to support it, because I had also lost faith in him as one of our elected leaders. So I was actually very consistent on that front. I have never supported a project without affordable housing. But there are cases in some projects where we can get more affordable housing off-site than we can on-site. Yeah. And so in those cases, I will support those projects, because the net effect is more affordable housing for more middle and working class families here in San Francisco.
Okay, let's take a look at another ad. This is from your campaign, Jane, and it has to do with landlords and tenants. Let's take a look.
He wants you to believe he's done something to stop evictions. He hasn't. Wiener opposed stronger protection for renters. He wants you to believe he isn't in the pocket of landlords. He is, and he said he was proud of their support.
Jane Kim, you're saying this man is in the pocket of landlords. Is that what you mean?
What I am saying is that when you look at the money that has come into this race, we have seen over $700,000 come in from realtors and speculators that opposed the 2002 and 2006 affordable housing bond here in San Francisco and have opposed Ellis Act reforms in Sacramento. Now, my opponent will say that his supporters don't represent all of his values, and I think that that's a fair statement on his part. But those individuals and entities have certainly decided who they feel will best represent their interests in Sacramento.
Scott?
There's definitely a lot of outside money that's come into this race. About $250,000 from the soda industry has come in to attack me and support Supervisor Kim because I'm a fighter for the soda tax. She opposes it. In terms of rent control, first of all, Senator Mark Leno, the champion for Ellis Act reform, has endorsed me. I have been a strong supporter of Ellis Act reform. I authored legislation to extend rent control to new in-law units. I authored legislation to extend rent control to long-term HIV survivors with federal housing subsidies who didn't have rent control.
There is a perception, fair or not, and I'll ask you to answer it, that you're a little conservative by San Francisco standards. You're a little even maybe cold-hearted when dealing with like tents, the homeless, that kind of thing, renters. What's your response to that?
Yeah, that's we all get caricatured in politics, and that is absolutely true in terms of how some people characterize me. That is not at all accurate. To call me conservative is, honestly, it's laughable. I authored legislation to ensure universal health care coverage for transgender people, legislation to expand water recycling and require developers to put solar panels on their units, to extend rent control. I'm not sure in what universe someone could be considered conservative with that record. And in terms of being cold-hearted, I co-sponsored the ballot measure on the ballot this year that will provide $50 million a year to permanently house homeless people. Every year in the budget, I deliver funding to get homeless youth off the street, to expand meal programs. I care deeply about people living on our streets, but it's not humane or progressive to let people live in tents on sidewalks.
You mentioned earlier, Jane, that it's important to send a progressive voice, a liberal voice. But, as he suggests, by any standard, by a statewide standard, you're both liberal. You're going to go up to Sacramento, and you're not going to be one of 11 like you are now. You're going to be one of 40 in the state Senate. And you may have to work with conservative Democrats who support, get money from the tobacco industry, or maybe even support gun rights, or the oil industry. How do you envision working with people who aren't progressive? Because it's not going to be like San Francisco.
So, over the last 2 years, in 2014 and 2015, my office actually passed more legislation than any member of this Board of Supervisors, and I did that without a 6-vote progressive majority. This is actually the first year I've had a 6-vote progressive majority on the Board of Supervisors. And so I have been able to work across the aisle, and I have been able to win votes along our more moderate or conservative
But again,
elements on the
it's
Board
going
of
to be a
Supervisors.
different story up in Sacramento, right? I mean, you might need actual Republicans, which don't really exist in San Francisco on the Board of Supervisors.
But what I'm saying is that over my 10 years on the Board of Education and Board of Supervisors, I have been able to pass a lot of legislation, and I've only been able to do that by crossing over and being able to partner with other people that may not necessarily completely agree with me. I am someone that is incredibly progressive in terms of my values. I fight for our renters. I fight for our working and middle class residents. I fought to raise our minimum wage to $15 an hour. I was only able to do that by crossing over and walking across the aisle and working with folks that may not agree with me. You don't pass major legislation without more broad-based support.
Scott, how do you envision it being different in Sacramento, passing legislation, getting it to the governor's desk, than it is now at the Board of Supervisors?
It's complicated. You're running a gauntlet to get good progressive legislation through in Sacramento. But it's interesting. When Mark Leno was on the Board of Supervisors, they said he was conservative, that he was not progressive enough. And he, of course, has gone on to be a progressive champion in Sacramento. And he understands how to thread that needle and work with people that don't agree with you and get legislation through. I've always been able to partner with my colleagues on the Board of Supervisors who don't agree with me, with John Avalos, with David Campos, with Eric Marr. And I'll continue to do that. To me, it's about never personalizing it. You can disagree intensely, but never making it personal, because you never know when you need someone's vote the next day.
I'd like each of you to say what you admire in each other. Jane, start with you.
I would say that Scott is someone who always stands up, and he takes actually very hard positions, and they're not always very popular. And as someone who also serves in public office, I will never, neg on that, because I know how hard it is to stand up in front of people and not always tell them what they want to hear. And that's something I've seen Scott do before.
Yeah. Scott, what about you?
Well, I will say I have really admired Supervisor Kim's work on pedestrian safety and street safety. And her district, South of Market, because of decisions made many years ago, has some very dangerous streets in South of Market, in the Tenderloin, and a lot of vulnerable pedestrians, seniors, people with disabilities. And Jane has really, she has been a real fighter for pedestrian safety, and we've been able to partner on some pedestrian safety issues. It's an area where we're in, I think, complete alignment.
All right, 24 days to the election. May the best person win. Jane Kim. Scott Wiener, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
We turn now to a story we've been following for many months. This week, the U.S. Department of Justice released a scathing report on the San Francisco Police Department. After a 9-month review, the DOJ found, quote, concerning deficiencies in every operational area assessed. Those areas include bias, accountability, and use of force.
Insufficient witness statements, insufficient gathering of evidence, crime scene management. Top to bottom, we found significant room for improvement in all of the administrative investigations and criminal investigations of uses of force.
94 findings and 272 recommendations. And I'm proud to report that the San Francisco Police Department will accept and implement every single recommendation.
The review was requested by Mayor Lee and former Police Chief Greg Suhr after the fatal shooting of an African-American man, Mario Woods, and a series of scandals involving racist, sexist, and homophobic text messages. KQED's Alex Emslie has been on this story every step of the way, and he joins us now. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Thuy.
Well, this was a pretty damning report. What were some of the most serious shortcomings?
I think that you mentioned the big three. Use of force investigations were found to be sort of shoddy. They're not tracking the officer statements in these cases up to and including, fatal officer-involved shooting cases. That was one of the more surprising things to me. There's been a lot of controversy around those kinds of cases, but the idea that the department hasn't found a way to sort of set up a strict protocol for how they're handled blew me away.
And if there's no protocol in place and you don't know the details of these officer-involved shootings, there's no accountability either.
Well, and accountability is another area that this report looked into, right, and found the SFPD lacking on some of that. A lot of that has to do with another big word that we've become familiar with in San Francisco around policing too. That's transparency, right? Maybe sometimes the department does discipline problem officers, address misconduct, but the public doesn't really know about it.
These recommendations are not binding the way that a court order might be. They weren't done by the DOJ Civil Rights Division. They were done by a unit that focuses more on community policing. So for these changes to happen, it will require real political will. That means collaboration between city officials, city departments, the police department, the police officers union. How likely will that kind of collaboration happen?
I think that that's sort of the million-dollar question, right? Now, I can report that the mayor's office issued sort of an executive order just today instructing every city department to collaborate with the San Francisco Police Department in implementing these recommendations. City leadership from the top down are taking this very seriously, and then I guess I would leave that to anybody's, sort of discretion to how they feel how they feel that'll play out over the long run.
I wanted to also ask you about the search for a new police chief as well. We heard earlier from Tony Chaplin talking about this. He agrees with the mayor. He, too, says he will treat these recommendations as binding. Any word, though, on when the decision on a new police chief will be made and whether acting chief Tony Chaplin is a front runner?
Well, I think that to the extent that Tony Chaplin is the interim chief right now, and to the extent that this process has become politicized, he has that name recognition, right? And he's been in charge of implementing these reforms even before the final report came out. He's been big about saying we're going to get ahead of this. Anything that we know that we can address ahead of time, we're going to do. And they have made some changes. We've seen a rollout of body cameras in the SFPD, just for one example. There are other candidates. Initially, there were more than 60 from both inside the department and outside. Now, the police commission needs to whittle that down to 3, which they're doing. And
what's the likelihood, though, that the person will come from inside the department, or is there a feeling that it has to be someone from the outside to make wholesale changes? We have about 10 seconds left.
There's certainly a feeling that an outsider could make these changes, but there's also an argument that an insider would know the city and know the department and be able to carry them through.
All right. Okay. We will keep on top of it. I know you will keep on top of it for when that announcement on a new chief happens. Alex Emslie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
At Stanford University, it's been called the most popular elective class on campus. 2 professors created the course, Designing Your Life, to help students find fulfilling careers by learning to think like a designer. Now they have a new book titled Designing Your Life to help those wanting to make a career change or build a more meaningful life. Joining me now are the authors, Bill Burnett and Dave Evans. Welcome to you both.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, Dave, beginning with you, I hear the term design thinking more and more. A lot of people, though, still don't know what it is. How would you describe design thinking in a sentence?
Design thinking is a practical, hands-on approach to solving a special class of problems, which are the messy human problems we call wicked problems, by leaning into your curiosity and prototyping your way into the future that you want.
Okay, so with that, I've taken design thinking as it applies to work projects, right? You have a concept, you build prototypes, but Bill, how does that apply to life and building your life?
Yeah, it turns out it's a really simple transmutation of the idea. We call life prototypes things like interviews. If you go interview someone who's doing the thing you want to do, you can learn to live in the future that is maybe the thing that might be you by talking to somebody and getting their story. Or you can prototype an experience by going somewhere and having the sort of embodied experience of what that might be like. And both of those things give you a little bit of data about a possible future that you're curious about.
So give me a concrete example of, say, a dysfunctional belief, and how would you reframe that to design your life?
Well, there's a lot of dysfunctional beliefs in the book. One is this notion that, by a certain age, you're supposed to have it all figured out. It used to be, I guess, in my generation, by 20 or 25, you were supposed to have it figured out, your career, your life, your relationships. Nowadays, that's just not true. I mean, people are living longer, they're exploring more, and so this notion that you're late or that you haven't got it figured out in time is a really big dysfunctional belief.
So then how would you reframe that?
Well, we reframe that. The question, what do you want to be when you grow up? We reframe as, well, first of all, don't grow up, because being childlike and curious is great. And second, what do you want to be? What do you want to grow into next? What do you want to become next when you're on this journey of life? Because probably the data says you're going to have 2 or maybe 3 careers. So getting good at figuring out what comes next and how you want to live into it is a really important skill.
And Dave, you've had a long career in tech. You led the design of Apple's first mouse, you co-founded Electronic Arts, and now you teach. How did that come about? Was that the result of you applying design thinking to your own life, saying, maybe teaching is what I want to do as my next career?
Yeah, I'm teaching the class because I couldn't take it when I was 19. I mean, we got here because I'm really bad at this. I was really, really bad at this when I was 19 and 20 and sort of bludgeoned my way into my own future, and noticed along the way, particularly when I was on the first corporate culture committee at Apple, then we wrote the manifesto before the business plan at Electronic Arts. It was all about creating places that people wanted to work and that nurtured them. And everybody was struggling with this question, and most people didn't have a good way to go about it. I thought, this is kind of criminally negligent. Both companies and higher education are just not doing this very well. So when the chance to teach on this stuff came up, I jumped at it over at Cal, and then Bill got this new job at Stanford, and we had lunch, and now we're here.
We live in a society now where these are troubling times for a lot of young people, right? We have a fickle economy. Success is often defined in terms of monetary terms or your celebrity status. What are the types of pressures that you see associated with that for your students, and how do you get them to work around that and reframe all that and apply this design thinking to cope with all that?
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned reframing, which is one of the mindsets of a designer. So when we say think like a designer, start with curiosity. Reframe the problem, because if you're chasing fame or money, you're not going to be happy. All the data says that money is not going to make you happy, fame's not going to make you happy. You have to find your own kind of internal compass. And so one of the things we have people do is they write a life view. What are you here for? What's the meaning of life? And they write something we call a work view, which is, why do you work? And then by putting those two things together and seeing how coherent they are, you get a sort of internal sense of where you want to go. And that's very different than what the culture tells you.
And then you have to come up with something called an Odyssey plan. Talk about that.
Well, yeah, we named the 20s and really the rest of our lives as the Odyssey, because if you're never really done growing up, then you're always in the adventure. So the Odyssey is, what's the next adventure going to be? And by Odyssey planning, we talk about what your future might be. But because there's more aliveness in each of us than one lifetime permits us to live out, there's more than one of you in there, Thuy, then we can't plan your future, we can imagine your futures. So the Odyssey planning process is to come up with 3 completely different images of your next 5 years, radically different ways you could be, all of which are true, which are incomparable. You know, they're apples and oranges and pickles, you can't really compare them. And then that gives you the ability to hear from yourself what it is you're really after.
So, okay, all this sounds good, right? If you're in your 20s, you have your whole future ahead of you, but you don't have that many responsibilities. How do you take that then and apply it to people of all ages? For example, people who are mid-career, for example. Now they've got mortgages, they've got kids, they've got, you know, car payments.
Yeah, we've worked with a bunch of mid-career folks and done this at a number of tech companies. And you're right. The degrees of freedom are a little different. Work-life balance is a really big issue when you're in your mid-30s and 40s and you have a new family. But everybody has curiosity, and everybody has the opportunity to kind of explore the space. In fact, constraints are actually pretty good. If you don't give designers constraints, they don't do anything. So constraints, deadlines, the things that you have to get done. This isn't about designing some kind of fantasy life. It's about setting really low bar, clearing it, trying something else, developing your creative confidence that you can really plan and execute things for yourself. And using the process of prototyping to discover, kind of like what really turns you on, what makes you excited in the world.
You know, we often get asked, isn't this really just for college students or people starting out, or is it really just for elite students who have lots of choices? And the answer is no. The question, what do I want to do with the rest of my one wild life, is really important to everybody.
All right, lots of interesting concepts to think about. Dave Evans and Bill Burnett, thank you. Your book is out now. And that is it for tonight. Next week, we'll be talking to the candidates competing to represent Silicon Valley in Congress, incumbent Mike Honda and his challenger, Ro Khanna. I'm Thuy Vu. Thanks so much for watching. For all of KQED's news coverage, please go to kqednews.org.